Hey everybody, Dave Whitmarsh, CEO of Whitmarsh Consulting Group, and today um, I'm really looking forward to this. I spoke with CJ for about 10 minutes prior to this, never met before, and I think that you guys are gonna love this. So thanks for jumping on, CJ.
Absolutely, David. I'm excited to have this conversation as well.
Yeah, so to put some context out, you have a book. But let's that's coming out, and we'll get to that. But let's just talk about your core business and how you got there. So go ahead, man.
Sure. So my core business is diversity, equity, and inclusion. My organization is Ascension Worldwide, and we provide services for Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, nonprofit organizations on a local and global scale. We provide training, keynotes, assessments, retreats, strategy sessions, and on and on and on, right? We have some e-learning products as well. So that's pretty much what we do. And we do it in a way that is different than, we don't see people who do the similar thing as competitors. We just see them as people who do it a little different. So my background, as I mentioned before in our call, is engineering. So I approach this work from that perspective. I have a black belt, Six Sigma. I actually do know karate as well.
A double black belt?
Yeah, double black belt, right. So I approach it, from that perspective and getting to the business case and the bottom line and how do we create impact in this work, right? And so, so that's a little bit about, how we do it.
Cool. And yeah, and I guess you have to be somewhat flexible to work with companies as far as getting ultimately your message or best practices merged
Right.
with the best flow of communications with the company. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And so you have a book coming out.
I do. I have a book coming out. It's What's Your Zip Code Story? How to Understand and Overcome Class Bias in the Workplace. Yes.
And so talk a bit about some of the findings or how you came about that topic. And
well, okay, let me see how much time we have. So I'll give you the short version of it. So I was pretty new in the diversity world. And so I actually was having a conversation with one of my colleagues, and, we were talking about experiences of bias, of having, being excluded from our past. And I was talking to a gentleman, and he was an African-American male, similar to myself. He was older and he was gay. So in my head, my story, right, was, okay, so he's going to have an extra level of bias against him, right? So my experience is probably, a different. And in my mind, he'll probably have more biases. But as I talked to him a little bit more, I realized that he was talking about not being accepted to the country club. When I was growing up, we weren't even thinking about a country club, right? We was talking about a clubhouse or something, a tree house or something. So the more and more I talked to him, the more and more I realized our experience was different. And our experiences was different, not because of race, but because of class. And that led me to doing a presentation at the company I was working for, a brown bag, chat and chew conversation. And to see the people's faces light up when they heard and engaged in this conversation about their own experience, right? No matter what their race and education level, where they were from, they were all like kind of leaning in. And then I submitted this proposal to SHRM, the 2019 SHRM Inclusion Conference. And I was blown away by how the participants responded. Literally, they had to cut the lights off and unplug the microphones because people were so excited about this topic. And it wasn't just me being a great facilitator, but it was that, creating the space to be heard, and not just heard from the perspective of my skin color or my gender or any of those things, but really my own personal story and what that means. And how does that apply to, the workplace, and how does it impede my growth at times? And how can I use it to move forward? And most importantly, how can companies leverage this genius, right, that makes you special and unique to move the company and the business case forward, right? And so that's really how I got started. I didn't want to write this specific book. The book was written through my experiences of others' stories and how they showed up in the room at SHRM. And from there, I started the long process of writing the book. So that's how it got started.
Well, congratulations for going through that process, and warning to everybody that thinks it's a good idea to write a book. It takes 5 times, 10 times longer to do than you think it's going to. And by the way,
Yes,
there's
absolutely.
Also no money at the end of it. So,
Yeah.
unless
Well, I
you're
would say,
very
depending on if you
lucky.
go out and speak, yeah, there's opportunity. But I would say don't write a book for money. I would definitely say that.
Yes.
Write it for the impact that you want to have, the legacy you want to leave.
Yeah, very cool. Well, you know, it's super interesting that, and I'm, you know, we talked about this for the few moments. You know, I've never been noticeably part of any bias, but that's ignorant in saying that. I'm sure that I have been the other way around, right? But it's just a mess, and I can sit down even with my wife,
Mhm.
and we can share stories, even though we're, you know, both Caucasian, roughly the same age, and
Mhm.
although, you know, different sexes, and we have different views on things
Mhm.
based off of our
Mhm.
experiences. So, you know, really, and you said something before the call that I think is brilliant. You know, you get to know somebody,
Mhm. Yeah.
and I can't remember your exact words, but you know, if you get to know somebody and find out that they're a good person, or you might learn they're a bad person, but but
Yeah.
at least you know it, right? So don't
Mhm.
assume it.
Mhm.
So this, have you tied this, some of your findings into some of your work at all?
Yeah, yeah, we definitely talk about it. We are introducing it even more into the conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion. And so, in the way that obviously our work is founded in the brain science. So we are supported to the work we do by Dr. David Kahneman about in his work about how the brain processes information. He says we have 2 systems in the brain. We have a fast brain, we have a slow brain. System 1 is the fast brain, and our knee-jerk reactions live in there, right? And so I was thinking about well, how does that tie in, right? So the brain, you know, as you mentioned, you talked about having a conversation with your wife and having, you know, different experiences. So the brain naturally classifies people, places, and things. We don't have to do anything. It's automatic, right? 99.9% of our biases we're not aware of. So when we get up in the morning, when we, you know, decide what we're going to wear today, it's based on our background, our past experiences. When we're in the grocery store and we're rolling our cart down and we're looking at the checkout attendants, we're making a decision who we're going to go to, right? Based on our time, based on, oh, that person has so many so much food in their basket, they must be feeding a tribe or something. We calculate that and classify it and say it's going to take too much time. It's the same thing. It's the same part of the brain that engages when HR professional looks at a resume and they see a school that they're familiar with or that they hold in high regard. The brain classifies that without intention, without control, without awareness, and it impacts a lot of people in a negative way and some people in a positive way. And so, you know, already when we're talking about bias, we're already talking about class bias. The biggest difference is when we talk about bias, we lean to talking about race, we lean to talking about gender, we lean to talking about sexual orientation, in some cases, political affiliations. Now, those things are interesting and sometimes very, very important conversations, but we're leaving awareness off the table, right? Because when your brain sees someone, yes, skin color comes into play, but also how their dress comes into play. Also, how, whether whether someone's wearing a wedding ring or not, right? Now, you may not know, as you talked about earlier, we don't know if that person's married or not, but we evaluate, or the brain evaluates it and says, are we more likely to trust someone, a male that's married versus a woman that's married? So the brain goes through all of these different computations, and the algorithm is engaged and it says, okay, this is better than this, especially when you have to make decisions quickly. So it's been very easy really to start to bring people over. And actually, honestly, people are really excited about this conversation, as we talked about it earlier. There are lots of conversations that are focused on different identities, and some, not all, are polarizing, right? Because people don't know how to have these conversations. So they've gotten past the place of, let's have diversity within our organizations, right? So now we're like, yeah, we got diversity, or at least we know we don't have it. Let's work on it. So people are getting to the place where we know about inclusion, and we're starting to infuse inclusion opportunities into our day-to-day work life. Inviting people to meetings, considering our marketing strategies, all those other things. And then equity is another thing that people are still wrestling with. But when we look at the impact of what actually gets done at the end of the day, once we consultants leave the organization, what we find based on research is that statistically and across many organizations, the impact of the training of just diversity, equity, and inclusion is not sustainable without doing more work or having uncomfortable conversations, which is what we talk about when we talk about the zip code story. In our company, we like to say, get comfortable having uncomfortable conversations, because it's the only way that leads to a more inclusive workplace.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think that there's, I don't know if you follow Trevor Noah at all.
Yes. Yes.
But Trevor has these takes in between guests.
Oh yeah.
And so one was, somebody asked him, and for Trevor, his celebrity took over for Jon Stewart on the Daily Show Comedy Channel, right? So let's say it's not news. He's still on the Comedy Channel, but he's very aware. And somebody asked him, what was it like growing up in South Africa? Being a minority under apartheid, and how did it come along progressively so fast compared to other countries? And he said, we had conversations, and they were hard, and sometimes they hurt your feelings, and sometimes you had to tell people what the problems were. And he said in North America, sometimes we just say that's offensive. And he said, and then it's like, oh geez, I better remember that. I don't want to be offensive.
Yes.
But we don't know why. We don't have that conversation to say, this is why, or that's, this impacts me a certain way. So it's important, I think, to have the conversations,
sure, and
be open enough to explain and talk about them. Because you mentioned a word in our pre-call here, that's something that I really suck at, to be perfectly honest with you.
What was that? What word?
Empathy, or empathy.
Oh, empathy. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so I generally am pretty horrible with that, but this isn't about me. But having the ability to share that empathy comes from learning, right? And I think that if you give your story or share your thoughts and share your pains, then it helps you change your thinking.
Yeah, I totally agree. You mentioned empathy, and I always quote Brene Brown. She talks about the 4 components to empathy by Teresa Wiseman, who's a nursing scholar. And she says that, perspective taking and staying out of judgment and communicating about your emotions and understanding other people's emotions are the 4 qualities. And one of the hardest things to do is to take perspective when you've not had that experience. And I always share with people when I talk to people who are English is not their first language. I remember an experience I had working at a consulting firm, and a lot of people who were English was their second language. They complained about the time frame that they needed to process information in order to be correct, and we heard it. So we thought we were being inclusive. So what we said, okay, we got it, but we still need it done at this time. So it didn't really come off as a sense of belonging, or we didn't put any processes in place for inclusion or equity, I should say, until I went to, I was in Chile And my Spanish is horrible. And so I know like 12 words. And I was speaking at a conference, and I went to this small town I was staying in an Airbnb. They did not speak Spanish, and it was late at night. I was trying to order some food before the restaurant closed. And I'm going to tell you, I didn't get what I ordered. I barely ate. And so when I came back and saw those consultants again, we didn't have to say much. I just said, I get it. That's what perspective taking means, is really putting yourself in their shoes. And maybe you don't travel to another country, but when you put yourself in a position when you're the only, or what we call the only, mean you're part of the minority, and how uncomfortable that feels, whether you're male or it's based on race or gender or sexual orientation, it feels very uncomfortable. And when you can have that experience and go to someone else and say, I get it. And when you get it, you don't have to talk much about it. It's like, we understand. That changes the trajectory of the conversation to more an inclusive conversation, more of belonging, more of a, I understand your pain and challenges. How can I support you, without as much conversation around? So yes, it's important to have empathy, but it's even more important to strategize. And again, I said my background is engineering. So how do we process and prove empathy?
Right. Yeah, well, if you figure out a way to be better at it, let me know. Right. And so explain, in case anybody's not familiar, what do you mean when you say the zip code? You reference that, like, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think it's what does it mean to everyone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on a global scale, right? So when people hear a zip code that they're familiar with, right, they are there's a story that's created in their brains about that zip code. And if it's your hometown, there was maybe it wasn't a train tracks like on the bad side of the tracks, but there was a part of town that you knew and everyone knew, that everyone believed that people were there were smarter or nicer or had more education, or it was dangerous, right? And all you had to do was say the area or the zip code, right? But the zip code story goes beyond just where you grew up. It expands to how you grow up. It expands to the sights and sounds outside of your door, the conversations around the dinner table. I mean, there's studies that show that your conversations around the dinner table is how you learn new words from a vocabulary perspective, right? So your education is really informed by the conversations around your dinner table or in your household, or well, it's informed one way or the other. And so this really starts us to have the deeper look about how we grew up and how that shapes the way we see the world. It shapes the way we connect with one another. I've met people working in consulting in different groups that have said, when they went to school and college, that was the first time they saw a person of color. And so having that experience, that's going to shape the way you engage, right? And it's not always a negative thing, right? But it is to say that when we come into the workplace, into a multicultural experience, our backgrounds influence how we connect with people, work with a lot of people from different cultures. And where I grew up, we always gave people personal space, right? 6 feet or more, right? And so I noticed that when we work in different cultures, that's not true at all for many cultures. Sometimes I'll, work with companies. The whole company will come from another country to do work here. And I remember, trying to build a relationship with this group from Haiti. And my dad was in the military, and he said, if you want to get a job in this world, you got to know how to shake hands. And you need to do it just like this: palm to palm, web to web, go in for it, strong handshake, look them eye to eye, 3 pumps, and then release, just like that, right? So that's the way I had always, greeted people. And so this time I reach out my hand, and the woman who's in charge does not shake my hand. She goes in for the hug and the kiss on both sides of the cheek. And so I'm thinking, maybe it's the shirt that I have on. It's a really nice shirt. People really like the shirt, right? My own blind spot. And so the guy who's behind her is a second in charge, and he looks like one of those guys that had been working out since he was 2 years old. He has like veins popping out of his arm. And in my mind, my story, because of my background, you don't want to get one of these handshakes like this, right? You want the strong handshake. So I go in for the strong handshake, and he doesn't shake my hand either. He goes in for the hug, and yes, the kiss. on both sides of the cheek. Long story short, later on, I found that many countries around the world, they don't shake hands. They do it when they're working with US-centric companies, but they kiss. There's actually a kissing chart, right? So I was in Chile, it's one kiss, right? And Haiti was colonized by the French, so it's two kisses. So that experience is really, again, shaping how our zip code story is expanded. And that's really what the book is about, right? So I grew up one way, I meet someone, and all of a sudden there's conflict because now people are kissing me, or they're too close to me, or they're saying things, or they're doing work in a different way. And there's conflict in my head. But to get outside of that, I have to have that experience. And as you said, the uncomfortable conversations at times, and then to navigate that, right? So now I go to different countries, obviously not in COVID, I make a decision whether I'm going to engage in that. Or if I say, I'm from the States and I prefer not to, kiss, but I don't, because, pre-COVID, yes. So anyway, yeah, so the zip code story really just really focuses on that unique story that you have, and how that might shape the way you see the world, which again, your brain categorized, we call class bias, or classification. And we do this in what Daniel Kahneman calls the fast brain, system one, where biases live. And to know that that's happening, and to also give people grace, and as you said, empathy, because if I haven't had that experience yet, is it wise to shun me so soon? Could we create an inviting way to bring different conversations into the bigger conversation, I'll say.
Yeah, and I think it's just knowledge and respect, right, are two things that we need to understand. I'll share a quick story about my I wasn't there, but my brother tells it best. So my brother took off and lived in Japan and taught in Japan for a year. We all know people that teach all over. And my parents went to visit him. Well, he was in remote town of 10,000 people, quite far away from everybody, or all the big populations. And they had a local bar that they'd go to, and they had you basically buy a bottle, and you put it up and the barkeep keeps it up on the shelf, and every time you come in, he just brings you down your bottle, and he charges you based off of how much he thinks you've drank, right, of that day. And so, but the tipping or custom where my brother was that you leave your glass full. Well, my dad could not get that. My dad thought it was the craziest thing ever, and he'd drink his glass, and the keeper would come over and fill it up, and then he'd drink it, and the keeper would come over, and eventually he was hiding it under the table. So and my brother's like, "Dad, you're being really insulting here, right? Like you don't do that." And he's like, "Well, it doesn't make sense, but it's it's not up for him to determine, right? It's him to assimilate sometimes." So
Right.
So is the book out, CJ?
Yeah, great question. So the book comes out on May the 20th, 2020, 22, and it's available at anywhere you can purchase books, specifically Barnes and Noble and Amazon.
Cool.
So they can purchase now. They can go and do pre-orders, but people who have done pre-orders have actually already received the book. I see it posting on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and people are texting me, showing me the book. And so I'm like, yeah, great, we got it early, right? So yeah, so that's awesome.
That's exciting. Well, congratulations, and I'll be sure to have a link if anybody's watching this. Take a look at the description below, or somewhere there'll be a excuse me. There'll be a way that you can connect with CJ to discuss business and helping your organization with leadership and some diversity initiatives you might have on the go. And then there'll be links to where you can purchase the book, and I think it'll be a fun read and looking forward to it myself. So
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
you're doing good work, and keep it up, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.
Take care.